Yo, so we're beginning. This is the start. Hello, beautiful people. Start of our little webinar series. Some cross-cultural yarnings across from Indigenous Australia to Indigenous Wales. Yeah, you fellas want to jump in, say who you are and what we're doing? That shouldn't all just rest on my side. I don't know. You got to talk up. Go.
I'm Chels Marshall. I am situated on country up in Gumbaynggirr country on the northeast of Australia, northeast coast. Yeah, and I'm looking forward to the chats and yarns today and the listening.
Good morning. I'm Beth. I'm from Wales and I'm from South Wales, and that will have some particular bearings on things, as I'm sure Dave will do the comparison with his North Walian heritage. And yeah, looking forward to talking to you a little bit more about our culture and the way we see things and how that entangles with complexity theory.
Dave Snowden. I think probably one of the things I'm known for is saying that complexity isn't just about mathematical modeling and computing, it's about people and people interactions. And if I think Tyson knows this, but Chels doesn't, a lot of this original work came from work I did on land rights in Darwin back in the 70s, which was a really scary experience. So that link between different knowledge bases is important. And the word Cynefin, which I'll just mention now, means in Welsh is the place of your multiple belongings. It's the sense of being rooted in many paths which profoundly influence you are, but also which are constantly changing, so you can never go back. Yeah, you have to live with where you are, and that was the sort of word I chose to describe what we did. So that's my background.
So what's your Cynefin there? That's in North Wales?
It's actually, I mean, you said I had to tell the Welsh joke. It's less a Welsh joke. It's more a sort of scary story. I think there are two things about being Welsh, right? One is, yes, I grew up in North Wales. So the mountains of North Wales is where I spent my childhood. And every now and then I forget to give them the respect. So I've had 8 stitches and 2 broken ribs and almost died on Tryfan and Glydavach, but I know they'll never kill me. They're just teaching me a lesson to show them the respect I next come. But it was an interesting childhood because my mother was South Walian, like Beth, she came from Cardiff Docks. In fact, she was born above a whorehouse in Cardiff Docks and fought her way out through education. Studied German in Germany in 1947 and had to wear a passport around the neck so she wouldn't get raped by British and American soldiers. And then she taught in North Wales, where I grew up, and the South Walians don't like North Walians, we're deeply tribal. But she took me back to Cardiff every holiday, so I really thought I was a South Walian. But I also lived in Northwest Wales, and everybody in Northwest Wales thinks everybody in Northeast Wales are really Liverpudlians. So this living in different communities, none of which respect you, is kind of like a part of that. And I remember once being in the States and we were working on counterterrorism, and somebody very senior in the US government said, I found somebody else who's Welsh working in counterterrorism. And I remember saying, well, where does he come from? And he said, that's what he asked about you. And I said, you've got to understand it about the Welsh. We have to find out where you belong. Yeah, are you Welsh or are you English? It's pretty important, all right? Are you North or South? That's important. If you're South, are you East or West? We'll get it down to a valley. So we have to find a way that we can have some sort of conflict with you. It's almost built into the culture, but it's that geographical identity which is part of it.
That's it, and that's quite subjective. I mean, when Chels said that she's in Gumbaynggirr land in the north, I'm like, straight up, I'm like, oh, that's not north. That's not north, that's south. So yeah, you know, my family's located right up the top, like far north Queensland, you know, and but I'm currently 3,500 kilometers south of there in Melbourne, you know, and you know, kind of sat in front of a machine that I've been sitting in front of all day, just moving from one blue square to the next. And look, you're another blue square now.
Yeah,
I'm
it's
hoping
for
we
you
can.
and Borodar for us in the Welsh, all right?
Yeah, we can. I'm hoping we can. Yeah, we can bridge that. That sort of. There's a kind of dislocation that comes. This dissociative thing that happens. When you're spending too much time in front of a screen in a dark room. So anyway, I'm hoping we can bridge that and come into this science of relations that we're all experiencing, that we're all working in and thinking through. This, yeah, it's a complexity for me is a science of relationships. It's a method of inquiry. It's a process of sense making collectively in the world, and yeah, that's something that we navigate together. So let's begin the navigation. Protocols first for and that's we've got to share these stories and have our protocols set up. So that's why I wanted you to share that joke, Dave, so that we could get a sort of agendaed protocol in place here as well.
It's what a lot of people don't realize is that South Wales is a matriarchy. If you look in the mines of South Wales and the mines of North Wales, the tradition was the husband would give his wage packet to his wife on Friday. In fact, the wives would queue up at the pitch head to collect them. And then the wives would give the beer money back to the husband, and then the wives would take the money and look after the community. And that's a long-standing tradition. But the order of fear for the Welsh male is you're mildly scared of your mother. Well, actually, you do what your mother says, right? The old joke, which is, I think, the one you wanted, right, which is a bit sexist, says a boy comes home from school to his mam and says, it's a mam in Welsh, by the way. We don't talk about mothers, they're mams. And says, I've been given a part in the school play. And she says, oh, what is it? That's good. And he says, I'm the Welsh husband. And she says, go back and get a speaking part. Right? And yeah, I like that one, right? Because it summarizes it, all right? So the order of fear is your wife is a fearsome factor, yeah? Your daughter, and Beth knows my daughter, is more fearsome. You do whatever your mum says. If your grandmother is angry with you, you prostrate yourself and wait for forgiveness. And if your great-grandmother is angry with you, you leave the country and wait for permission to re-enter. And that's the sort of basic cultural thing.
Mm.
But that looking after the community is quite interesting. So I just throw something else in. There's another tradition in Wales which is really important. In the mines of North Wales.
You always throw something else in.
Well, you do as well.
Are you an elder? Are you an elder there or something? Because I tell
definitely, right?
You definitely
in the mines of North Wales, the miners built what were called cabans in the mines. And they'd meet in those cabans in their dinner breaks to talk about politics and religion, and they keep minutes because they refuse to be treated as just mine workers. And in South Wales, the miners built educational institutes and hired in lecturers to teach them because they wanted to be educated. And I think that issue about education, and that comes through in your book, is key. And at that point, I'll stop adding stories to the story and shut up for a bit.
It's all good in terms of setting up our governance here, negotiating and navigating our way forward, how we're going to do it. So what do you all think? We've got South Wales coming from a matriarchy there, and Chels. I think Chels, your mob's matrilineal. My mob's patrilineal, but my partner is from a matrilineal mob, so matrilineal. That's how I live.
Yeah. I know. Did we want to do the reciprocal acknowledgement for country here in Australia? And
yeah, I think so. I think we should.
I first of all, look, here in Gambanga country, our totem is the ocean, and yeah, it's quite expansive, the ocean. So it doesn't just take in the Pacific, but it connects through to all the, I suppose, the mixing of waters throughout, the ocean. And so everything that's connected then to the ocean, the finest mists of water that accumulate on the mountains and then move through that landscape and system and collect nutrients and move and flow. And then the interconnections between the species along the way is what I acknowledge firstly as a component and a part of the ocean and its dynamics and its creatures and its life. I also will broaden out and take it wider and acknowledge the Indigenous people of Australia and the Torres Strait, yeah, and just in the fact that we're spiritually and culturally connected to this country, and the country and the islands were crisscrossed by many brilliant nations and many different clan groups within those language areas. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island people, you know, we're Australia's first explorers, we're Australia's first navigators, first engineers, first farmers, first botanists, first scientists, first biochemists, you know, first diplomats, you know, first astronomers and the first and finest artists. Australia, you know, it's an old world, and that old world has many stories attached to it. And you know, we as Aboriginal people, you know, we engraved, you know, these maps throughout the whole country and the whole continent. You know, the earliest paintings and ceremony. We invented unique technologies that were derived from the landscape, engineered structures. You know, a lot of these are predate, you know, things like the Egyptian pyramids and Stonehenge. It's an old country, and our adaptation and our intimate knowledge of country enabled us to endure climate changes and catastrophic droughts and rising sea levels, you know, twice. And you know that it's always been a place that has needed Aboriginal people, and it's, you know, it always was and as always will be. You know, Aboriginal people intimately connected to this country, and I just wanted to acknowledge every single Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander person that you know, continues to practice and maintain and to enhance our culture on this side of the world.
Beth, you want to call back?
We don't have anything quite so wonderfully nuanced and I suppose ritualized as that. I think a point to start from is some of the Indigenous Welsh ways of being and knowing. I'd like to kind of acknowledge from the point of how obscured that they've become, and how difficult they can feel to access sometimes, particularly as a South Walian, whereby my sense of Welshness is far more obscured than I imagine most people in the North. But just in recognition of kind of the culture, the forefathers, the foremothers, that kind of bring us to where we are, and hopefully Dave and I can help unpick some of that kind of lesser tapped and lesser shared understandings from a more kind of historical and Indigenous Welsh culture.
I don't think we lost the understanding. I think it was more we lost the right to articulate it. So, I mean, the story I always tell, which is my grandmother, I mean, this is an old, everybody in Wales knows this story, nobody in England knows it. Around the turn of the last century, the English decided we should be educated, which is really very nice of them, and we should be grateful. I mean, they tell us we should be grateful, so we know that's the case. But it had to be in English. So if my grandmother spoke Welsh, and she came from Welsh-speaking West Wales, you know, father was a gamekeeper, she had a wooden badge hung around her neck in the school, which had WN written on it, which is Welsh not. And then she had to catch one of her friends speaking Welsh, at which point she could hand over the knot. And whoever wore the knot at the end of the day got thrashed by the teacher. Yeah, and I still remember whenever strangers came to the house, she put on this terrible English accent because she thought Welsh was dirty, and she didn't teach her children to speak Welsh. Yeah, and with that, you lose the language, you use the culture, you lose everything else. And that desire, you know, and you see it in empires, with the desire to conform people's culture through their language and to destroy their stories, is a universal. I mean, Adam Price, who's leader of the Welsh Nationalist Party, who's a good friend, famously wrote a book which said Wales is England's first and hopefully last colony. And they conquered us in the 13th century by getting us to fight against ourselves. If you look at every English war, every English invasion of Wales, they had more Welsh troops fighting for them than English troops, because they exploited tribal differences. And they did the same in Ireland, the same in India and elsewhere. And that ability, you know, if you're more concerned about your cultural dominance, you can actually break people up using their own cultural differences as a strength. And you see that all over.
That's the only way you can conquer people who've got mountains to go to. You know,
Yeah.
Otherwise, it's just all uphill.
Yeah, we survived 4 centuries. The English collapsed to the Normans in 5 years. You know, we lasted 4 centuries, but ultimately, yeah.
Yeah. Well, look, it's what strikes me about the Welsh is the narrative landscapes that you live in, and that's something that I can really recognize and connect with. It's the way, you know, and this is the mountain where the giant sat down and take off his shoes, and you know, it's all there. I'm sorry about
Tempest torn, Plymouth's crowning glory, to quote Dylan Thomas. Right? But you have to remember all the English.
Am I allowed to do your accent, or is that offensive?
It can be, all right.
It can.
We're cautious about it. And native Welsh speakers, and I'm not one, can tell which valleys somebody come from. And the other interesting thing about Welsh, I'll come back to what I think is a key theme in a minute, is the first letter of every noun changes according to the word that comes before it. Yeah, and it's actually meant, so Cymru, which is Welsh, which begins with a C, if you say the Welsh, it becomes a Gymru. And it's evolved so you can sing a sentence as a word, which is, if you hear a native Welsh speaker, yeah, they speak so quickly because they're singing the stuff, and the words are changing, so they mutate together. And you can tell where somebody came from by the way they mutate the language, which is fascinating. But I think the big thing also is this concept. There are a whole bunch of words. I mentioned Cynefin is a one, all right? Huel is another, all right? And Beth knows more than I do on that, all right? There are words in Welsh which mean things you can't translate into English. So Cynefin is one. And it's a land-rooted thing. One of the other interesting ways in Cynefin is used is the sheep in Wales pass on to their lambs the boundaries of the land. So we don't need boundaries. Because the sheep know the boundaries. That's one of the other uses of Cynefin, because it's this rootedness concept. Yeah, in terms of the way things work. So I think that ability of a language to convey concepts is key. And when I got into knowledge management, we worked heavily in narrative-based knowledge. And some of the things we're trying to do, for example, with SenseMaker in software, is to recreate the oral tradition. Because the oral tradition is a living story. It changes as it's told. And one of the worst things that happened in Europe is the Grimm brothers and Hans Christian Andersen wrote the stories down. So they actually started evolving by being told around the campfires. And this concept of narrative weaving a continuous metaphor between people, I think, is something we've lost.
There's a particular saying that always feels really resident with me, which is "Dod yn ôl at fy nhroed," which means to return to my trees.
Yeah.
And that is to, in modern kind of positivist terms, to be in good mental health. But the poetic nature of that language and what it means and its rootedness to the land feels totally different. And I don't know how that resonates outside of somebody from a Welsh context, but to return to your trees, to be in your origin, to be at one with your environment, is to be well. I'm sure that probably translates across, I imagine, nearly all Indigenous cultures in terms of the groundedness of understanding and being at one.
Yeah, and that's beautiful. That's such a nice, like, what do I call it? Like a proverb or a word of wisdom. It's beautiful. And like I've had a conversation with Tyson before about that, the oral knowledge and that handing down, and the place and the situation of, where that takes place. Yeah, and it somewhat is this thing that like collapses time and space, because of that nature of it being stored. And often have friends refer it to, it's like a, like Aboriginal people or Indigenous people invented the cloud. And it's this cloud of multiple people holding multiple components of story. And then when you come together, it's like this collective knowledge base. And it's in that realm where that transmission and that participation throughout hundreds and hundreds of generation then sort of collapses this time and space sort of continuum. Because I could be in that same space through my language and through my story than what my great grandmother was. And I'm still in country, and I still see the same landscape and the same features as she did, and have that that tradition that's attached to it. It's really beautiful. And that codex of multiple people having that, and Indigenous people being the first inventors of the cloud, is where this sort of all gets stored. And if something happens to one clan or one mob, or happens to someone else, and or they move on or pass on, the story, because it's held with multiple people, it still contains or keeps its holisticness. And then that holisticness, the identifier is those features that are in the landscape, like the mountain, the tree, etc. It's a very I would call it simplistic, but some would call it complex, that way to store information and knowledge embedded with people and landscape. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, in so many different modalities, but also being held by so many different entities in the landscape, human and non-human. It is I don't know what you'd call it, like a distributed autonomous organization or something like that.
I think it links with the identity issue. So
it's there, and it's beautiful.
Wales has a strong tradition of music and poetry. In fact, if you don't know, Shakespeare's grandmother was Welsh, and he brought 700 words from Welsh into English. Because they said things for him.
But then he passed. He passed for English, didn't he?
Called the Eisteddfod, which is in schools as well as nationwide. And it's literally everybody comes together and sings songs and recites poetry, and repeats in public debate. And that's one of the ways the tradition is maintained. So every year in school, we had an Eisteddfod. And, I had status as captain of rugby, but I also had status as winner of the debating team. It was considered equally important to be able to speak within your peers as to play on the field. And I think that concept of poetry allows you to convey things which you can convey through simple text. But they've got to be told or spoken within communities. And again, I think those coming together traditions are really important.
So to what extent are those songs and stories maps as well? Dave, I wouldn't mind getting into at some stage. Not necessarily straight away, but
I think that they indicate pathway. Sorry, we'll get philosophical. I think poetry is what Deleuze called a line of flight. It's a way out of where you are at the moment. What a metaphor allows you to do is to escape from a pattern of meaning by seeing things from a different perspective. I mean, one of the projects Beth and I have just finished for the European Union is using metaphor and art as a way for people to interpret their narratives. Because if you go into an abstraction, you see things differently. And you can't see things differently if you just stay in the text. You've got to move up.
Well, that's what ritual is. Yeah, it's translating those things into metaphors, and working with those metaphors in that abstract space, I guess, would be one way of seeing it. So, country, like, you just in case people are listening from around the world, Chels and I keep referring to country, and that We're acknowledging country, which is an ongoing process, I think, through, when you meet with people like this from other country, it's not just a paragraph at the start and then you get on with your business. It's something that you keep coming back to right the way through. And country is that's the Aboriginal English term that we've arrived at. It's sort of like a capital C, and it doesn't have any articles in front of it. Like, it's not our country or the country, it's country. We're on country, we're acknowledging country. So, but in our traditional languages, it's usually, there would be not just one word, it's usually a few words that sort of describes that. So how I'm thinking of it in my head is translates as like our place. But then the word for place is also the word for time. And when you talk about our place, that also means in our way, that also means our way. So our way, our place also means our way. So the idea of country, there's a lot of layers to that. That you have all of your patterns of being, all of your governance structures, your economic structures, everything else is patterned within a landscape, and this is coming from country. So country is where you be, but it's also your way of being. And those ways of being, they make sure that those laws of the land are patterning through and being expressed through all of your social structures and everything else. And I guess that's where things get complex.
But this is a question on it, because when I was studying narrative, and Mary Douglas wrote a wonderful book on this. So in the Western tradition, you have Aristotle's concept of a narrative which follows the arrow of time. So you have a beginning, a middle, and end, and people get very upset if you don't do that, which is why you get the perniciousness of the hero's journey, which pervades too much of Western thinking. You then get ring form stories, which are the Arabic form, in which the meaning is in the middle of the story and the story builds and then reverses. And if the Old Testament is actually written as a ring form story, so that the meaning is completely different from the way people interpret it, because the lesson is in the middle of the story, it's not at the end. But every time I talked with anybody, any Indigenous storyteller, it was like the story's never finished. There were times when I remember saying to Auntie Beryl, is the story more real than reality? And it was the only time she thought before she answered something. And she said, probably yes, because the story is the meaning.
This is Auntie Beryl Carmichael from...
wonderful woman.
Yeah, Yampa. Mob out at there. Menindee, she stays out there in Broken Hill.
But I think that was interesting, because it was almost like that there was an intuition, and this is the complexity concept of entanglement, right? So you can't disentangle stories from metaphors, from people, from land, I don't think. And I think that's what complexity is about. If you take a reductionist approach, you're always trying to disentangle things and put things in taxonomies. So I keep emphasizing we deal with typologies, not taxonomies. And typologies are like your metaphor of the hand. You look at the hand, so you see things from different perspectives. And that's not a Neoplatonist concept. You're not saying there's something more real behind the shadows on the wall, but you're saying I have to look at things through different perspectives to understand them. But that doesn't mean those perspectives are categories. Yeah, and I think that's one of the key things in terms of how do you make this sort of entanglement work for humans.
There's something for me to be drawn from the work of Gabriel Garcia Marquez, and that's the idea that interpretation through realities and patterns that are not our own only serve us to make us kind of more unknown, less free, and more solitary. It's actually by putting an indigenous understanding or taking people out of their own indigenous understanding is deeply unliberating, as much as people believe it to be. Giving people power. The English gave us the English language, and we can communicate with probably the biggest chunk of the world in comparison to our tiny, less than 1 million people who speak our native Welsh language. But those words don't do justice to how it feels on the inside. That there are words in our Welsh language, the patterns of thinking that just cannot be given justice, even through the most poetic interpretations into English language. And I did see the word hiraeth doing the rounds on the chat.
Yeah.
Which
How the
is
hell do you translate Hirion? I mean, you know it. Can't translate it.
Well,
Yeah,
look-
so the kind of common understanding of it is a sense of homesickness for a place that's no longer, or might have never even been.
Yeah.
And I think for me that the bit that feels interesting here is that we know that something's been taken and obscured, and this is, we can feel it, but we can't find the language to do it justice. And I think again that comes back to this idea of the Welsh not and having language and articulation removed or obscured. But the passing of time, I kind of understand that within kind of Australian Indigenous culture, you first got introduced to the English, you know, a lot more recently than we did, and there's a sense to which we
Should have come for some advice. We could have told you what they were doing.
yeah.
a sense of assimilation on our part, or it feels like such a dim and distant history that it's very difficult to dig up, and somewhat traumatic when you start to do it, given that we've benefited so much from assimilating to our own oppressor in a sense, and you know, to an extent done it to other people.
Well, that and a lot of that comes back to whether or not you're in agreement with those categories, you know, that Dave was talking about, whether you start to see different perspectives as categories and taxonomies and all these sorts of things. And I guess, you know, one of the earlier pseudosciences, you know, when you look up all those old documents, you know, when the pseudoscience of race was being developed, you see all the original sketches measuring skulls and with these horrible caricatures of faces, and this is the Welsh race. Like I've seen the sketches, you know, this is the Cockney race here, and they've got these beady little eyes. And then you got the Welsh race, and they're like, oh, kind of
Worse
thing.
than that, Tyson. They invented a national costume for us in the 19th century. They did. They invented a national costume so we could dress in it.
Sorry, I shouldn't be laughing at your pain, but
it's kind of it's just crazy, that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
No,
we get culture invented for us, and then we have to reproduce that back, you know, for that Anglo gaze. It is very
but
hard.
the identity stays. What fascinates, I mean, we're doing some work in Europe. I mean, it was in Bruges, right? Europe is still culturally organized on a pre-Westphalian model. Yeah, the nation state has been imposed on it, but the Languedoc is not Paris, you know, where Beth is now in Helsingør. Yeah, Aarhus is not Copenhagen, Prussia is not Swabia. So those natural groupings of people with that shared history in that shared land still persist, yeah, over multiple generations in terms of the way it works. You don't lose that, I think. And there is this, it's one of the reasons why I find epigenetics fascinating, because it gives us a biological explanation of cultural inheritance. And it basically says identity isn't just about genes. Yeah, identity is about what's activated or not activated in your body and other people's bodies by the culture and the interactions you have. And I think that's happening. You know, what's coming out of epigenetics is fascinating. And one of the things I loved in your book is the concept of the fishing boomerang. You know, I've been using that ever since I got the book, because the boomerang handles refraction of light. I hadn't realized that until you said it. But if you use the boomerang properly, it corrects for the refraction of light. Now, we also know from material engagement theory that tools change cognitive functions. Yeah, so we didn't develop the concept of abstract number until the Sumerians invented counting tablets. So this concept of the ability of an artifact to intertwine itself also with human experience is, again, and I think it's one of the real problems. Eugenics lives today in adult maturity models in organizations. This is the big thing Nora Bates and I are talking about at the moment. The attempt to impose a step change maturity in which only the enlightened are at the higher stage and everybody else has to be led to it is a modern, basically, standard of eugenics. So this idea of something being superior to something else is a terribly pernicious culture, and it manifests itself in different ways.
Well, look, at the fishing boomerang thing, I have to tell you, I've never told anyone about that, actually. So this is a scoop. This is exclusive. But this, where did I get that knowledge from about the refraction of the light? Where did I get that knowledge about that fishing boomerang from? I actually didn't get it from story, and it wasn't passed to me from an old person. It was communicated through the affordance of the tool itself. So the angle that I had to make that tool on, and that was taught to me, that I was, I'm standing at the water using it, and I'm going, why is it that angle? And my hand is holding it, and my eye is led across that angle there, and I notice that if I line up this one with that one, that I can throw exactly where I need to throw it to hit the fish without having to calculate the light refraction in the water. So it was, even that knowledge was in the object, in my haptic relation with it. It was an affordance that was built into the peculiar angle of that instrument. And I think that's great, because it comes back to what Chels was saying before about all the different modalities and the way knowledge is distributed in our Indigenous knowledge systems is quite, it's a beautiful thing.
Skills introduction as well. I mean, Anne Pendleton, Julie, and I came up with this concept of what we call dark scaffolding. Yeah, if you want to look at an extreme sport, it takes 20 or 30 years for the scaffolding to emerge, because it's a mixture of practice and technology and experience. You can't just design it overnight. Now at 67, if I want to carry on walking on hills, I spend more money on my body than I do on my car, right? I've got no cartilage under my knees. Going out walking involves strapping physio tape all over them to keep the patella off the kneecap. But what's fascinating is if you look at boot technology, and if you look at trekking pole technology, it's evolved so it makes you stand in the right way. You actually don't have to know it, but it makes you stand in the right way. And I think it's that ability of humans, but it's an evolutionary process. It can't be done overnight. It takes time, because it's this mixture of experience. But I'm fascinating that's how you learn to use it, because it means the tools didn't just embed the knowledge, they embedded the ability to teach the knowledge.
Yeah. Chels, what were you bringing there?
Oh, I was just going to touch on that whole thing of like cognitive manipulation from like dominant paradigms, and how it's a really interesting dynamic when you start to talk to people about why there's these different perspectives and worldviews on certain things. And one of them, what I'm working with a lot at the moment is introducing Indigenous knowledge paradigms as a tool. So even referring to it as a tool, to help alleviate or build resilience and adaptation in the face of climate change. So, using that paradigm as a tool and labeling it as a tool, so people then can understand that, okay, it's a tool. That means that, we can adapt ourselves to be able to use it and apply it. And especially, in the realm of, sustainability and sustainable development. So, putting that Indigenous ideology on top of that to go beyond what we all know is sustainable, which is obviously not an Indigenous derived term either. But it's moving beyond to that point of actually becoming nature and becoming that place and that role within nature as a human. And I know you and I have talked about that before, Tyson, and I just found it really interesting, Dave, that you talk about these changes in and the referral to a tool, and it was just really interesting that if people start to acknowledge and see it, that and it's essentially a mechanism or a tool that enables you to be able to then adapt or to change that cognitive behavior or those inbuilt, I suppose, and embedded ideologies that you learn from a child or by learnt behavior and whatnot. So a lot of people find it difficult, and I think if you start to sort of delve into that whole systems approach, and see it as that, it makes it a bit easier to understand, I think.
I think it's the lived and inherited thing as well. I mean, I learned.
Well, it's essentially a psychotechnology.
Yeah, but I mean, I learned carpentry by building boats with my father. He never taught me carpentry. I just assisted, and after 5 years, I was allowed to actually cut something without him watching me. Yeah, and that built patterns into my hands and the tools. Yeah, and it was one of the metaphors I famously used. You know, if you pick up a tool and it fits your hand, it's a tool. If you have to buy or re-engineer your hand to fit the tool, something's going wrong. And if you have to change your brain to use the tool, which is a problem with a lot of the things like blockchain and holochain and these computer mediated forms of interaction, is they require us to, it's not a co-evolutionary process, it's an imposition. It's an attempt to put it into the wrong sort of frame. And like I think literacy. You know, that apprenticeship is key, right? There's so many things we can only learn by doing and watching. Yeah, we can't learn them otherwise. It's just not the same thing. And by making lots and lots of mistakes. I mean, the whole point about an apprentice model is you constantly, excuse the language, fuck things up. And that is a key part of the whole process of learning. It's those micro failures in a controlled environment through which you really learn. And that's one of the other things story does. Story teaches us about the failures of our ancestors, so we learn to avoid them. Yeah, and if you destroy that tradition, you destroy the ability to learn.
You need those cautionary tales.
Really interested in kind of digging a bit more into the idea of transgenerational sharing and mutation and adaptation of knowledge and understanding, if people want to pile in on that one.
Well, I think that's, I mean, there's an idea that a culture learns and develops knowledge over many generations, you know, through trial and error. And I've never been really one to go in for that that sort of evolution kind of theory, you know, of cultures, but mostly because of our particular cultural disposition here, is that we don't do trial and error. We have a mechanism to prevent that. But that is not good pedagogy, and that is not a good method of inquiry either, at all, not if you want to survive for longer than 500 years or so. Look, trial and error for us, the mechanism that prevents us from doing that is shame. So we have that there in our cultures. You're not allowed to mess things up. Like, you can't, the first time you do something, you have to do it perfectly. And so that forces you into a pedagogy with the master, you might call it. But it's a bit different. Just give us a minute, Dave. Let me get through this one. It's a very important pedagogy here. It's very important because it's the purpose for story. It's the purpose for everything. You can't learn, you can't master an activity, a skill, or any knowledge at all until you can completely inhabit the ontology of the person who knows that. And when you inhabit that ontology, and you're observing how they do it, then the first time you do it, you will do it perfectly, and you're expected to do it perfectly the first time. And inquiry sort of follows that same way. It means being able to inhabit the ontology of human and non-human entities within a system. You know, completely inhabit that ontology and be able to develop almost a theory of mind of that place or that system that you're coming into and you're trying to learn about or, you know, inquire about. You need to be able to do that, and that is what story does as a psychotechnology. Story is the tool that allows you to inhabit the ontology of a system in our way. So that's a long way around for saying why we don't have trial and error sort of baked in as a method of inquiry into our culture.
I wasn't talking about trial and error. And shame is common, all right? The shame I would feel if I couldn't do the work on the boat right from my father was a main driver, right?
Sweet.
So I wasn't allowed to execute something permanently until I could do it perfectly. But it was it was the micro failures that mattered. It was having the test piece. If you look at Campag, so the famous Italian firm Campag, all right? So they produce some of the most beautiful cycle equipment you can get. It's much nicer than Shimano, right? And the apprentices end up producing their own test piece, their own machine, which is perfect. So they're not actually, they don't finish their apprenticeship until they can do something perfectly. And they're allowed space behind that. That's not trial and error. That's learning by doing.
Yeah.
Right? And it's a different sort of process, I think. Right?
There's a distinction. Yeah, there is a distinction. Chels, what do you think about the distinction there before we move into the how cultures learn, how generations learn?
I was just going to add in there, Tyson, yeah, at the end while you're talking that, yeah, here on Gumbaynggirr country, we actually have a story that explains exactly that, and the whole shame mechanism, and doing things right the first time, and it's a story about the emu and the platypus, and the two boys, two young boys, they were ready, to show the clan and the group that they were about to become men, and that they could go out and do stuff because they've had these years and years of learning and observing and listening. But one thing that they then did was they let the ego come in, and then they started telling everyone how awesome they were at going to collect fish, and that when they come back from collecting fish, mate, they're going to feed the village and feed the clan and feed everyone. And then they went out, and then lo and behold, Murphy's Law, they didn't catch a thing, and then that they were so embarrassed, so shame that one started running and just did not stop running, and eventually turned into the emu, and then the other one dived into the water, and he kept swimming and turned into the platypus, and never to return back to the clan because they were so shamed. And that's something we use with our cousins. We'll just look at them and go, emu and platypus, like a code word.
Always emu with the narcissism every time.
Story in the Western canon which does something similar. If you've ever read Rudyard, Rudyard Kipling writes beautifully. Okay, he's a poem, but he writes the Jester stories. And he talks about how the armadillo was made. Yeah, in which the tortoise and the hedgehog become a new creature to protect themselves from the painted jaguar. And those stories tell you more about humans than any other stories, because they allow that sort of displacement.
Well, I don't like Kipling much because I've never kippled. Hey, but he those Just So stories were really, they were a technology that was, whether he wanted that or not, that was a technology that was deployed, a narrative technology that was deployed to pretty much ruin a lot of our law in Australia. The Just Stories, so that all of our dreaming stories were rewritten as children's fables. That is how the kangaroo got its tail, and that very much the old people were happy enough for that to happen, because that kind of provided a buffer, a protective membrane around our culture, so that people would run up against that and just encounter this childlike law, and then take that away, and that would prevent them from coming in deeper and taking the actual knowledge. So
he's only got one story about Australia, right? Sorry, his childhood. Yeah, there's one story about Australia. I take the point.
Yeah. Oh, he didn't write those, but they were copied for that. Sorry, Chels.
There's a point. Oh, sorry, Chels.
Oh, sorry, Beth. No, sorry, I'm half blind. I can't see.
Yeah. The point, I know that we kind of planted the seed about talking about scale here, and this kind of seems to lend itself to, if we can't ossify and write things down, because it takes away the living aspect of something, how do we scale, or how do we do things at a far bigger, more diffuse level without doing that? And there's another wonderful Welsh word beginning with C, which is called cofiadur, which means to be the keeper of the memory. The historian doesn't do it justice. It's the person whose role within a tribe or a group is to be the one that brings a bit of history with them. And actually, how in a modern world do we become multiple cofiadur? because one person's history nowadays is probably far more different to another's, whereas when we were living in smaller groups, we probably had much more common shared history, and we could have a nominated one. And how do we decentralize this into more of a systematic and, as you mentioned, kind of embodied way in order to scale some of these ways of knowing and understanding without it becoming overly constrained by one individual's understanding, or to be ossified in writing and unable to adapt and change?
An example here is the use of kin or species, and those species then become, you know, that foundation of connection between different clans or different mobs, and then through the knowledge system and the family, matrical, or whether it's through whatever lineage you're coming from, then that also spreads through as well. And it could be, for instance, my totem or my family's totem, could be related or associated to another mob. So, using those totems as those connecting variables, and through landscape, and that those systems within the landscape, it's and then you start to understand the patterns, and the patterns between people, and the patterns between people and country. It's complex when you start trying to break it down, but for many Aboriginal people, it comes like naturally, and it's part of that inherent inbuilt knowing of place, and where you are and where you're going. If you're going into someone else's country, you'll know that this is like a kangaroo mob, for instance, and then that sort of dictates and enhances your behavior while you're in that country. It's an interesting process of sharing knowledge.
There's never one person, eh?
No, and the interconnection, and it's through these multiple variables, and not just through people or oral exchange. It's through many factors that and a lot of them do derive from the landscape. Which,
and so if you're keeping platypus story, if you hold that story, it's like everybody holds different story and different knowledge, and knowledge of different totemic systems that reflect different symbioses, in the landscape and in the ecosystem as well. And so you end up with your society sort of following the same pattern as that ecosystem, and the knowledge is distributed, and it's constantly moving as well, and being exchanged. People will approach you if they want to go to that platypus place, or if they need to know something about it, etc., etc. Now, how it scales beyond that is that forms the clans and your kinship system, which determines who you can marry and which sort of groups you belong to, and totemic kind of, your meat and your totem and all that sort of stuff. So that pattern exists at the local level, but it's also at the non-local level. So when you go up to this other country, you go north a bit up here, then that where you'll fit in there, because it's the same kinship system, same pattern. So you go talk to other platypus people there, and they'll bring you in, the right way into that place. And so it scales on that same pattern. It's able to scale up from the local to the regional to the very much larger groups, and then even continental and beyond. So I guess that's the way it scales. It's in that fractal pattern, where that pattern of the kinship system at the local level is then scaled up, fractally, in every order of magnitude as you move through larger system.
Yeah,
the reason it can do that is the primary sorry, Chels. I was just going to say, the reason it can do that is the primary identity isn't the individual. The primary identity is the kinship group of the clan, and that's one of the great divides. I mean, one of the big negative things that the Reformation did in Europe was to assert the primacy of the individual over the collective. And then priests become people of power because they enforce doctrine. Before that, they were community reconcilers. They were hedgehogs, right? And I think that's one of the key things, all right? Certainly if you're Welsh or Scottish or Irish, your identity is your family, your clan, your glyn. It's not you as an individual, and they're not formed by your individual self-interest. And I think that fractal identity can't work and it can't scale if you focus on individuals and assembling individuals.
Mm.
I mean, just to throw something else into this, all right? Terry Eagleton is a long-term friend. We both edited a Catholic Marxist journal together in the 70s, which shows our provenance, right? He wrote a lovely book called Hope Without Optimism, and another book called Radical Sacrifice. Now, clans can sacrifice, individuals can't. And that's one of the big problems with global warming. Yeah, we have to have hope without optimism. We have to be able to make sacrifices. If everything is about the individual, neither of those are possible.
Mm.
Yeah, and that's the switch. It's that, and it's this identity. You have to feel part of the land, not own the land, in order to want to preserve it. Yeah, and you have to feel part of the tribe to preserve the tribe, not to see the tribe as just a mechanism by which you survive as an individual. And I think those are some of the key switches which are going to be needed for scaling.
Maybe that's how these systems scale through time, as well as space, through what Beth started talking about before, which is that intergenerational continuity. Which, that was a really good thing she threw in there. So I like it because it gave us that other dimension of time.
Because we know grandparents taught young children, and we think and it's linked to brain plasticity. So we know that, round about puberty, I mean, you don't see racism in kids before puberty. Puberty is where it kicks in, because you can't afford to learn anymore. You've got to exploit for the tribe. If you survive to your 40s or 50s, you need to go into the wisdom game. You're no longer physically fit enough, and you will teach and share wisdom. So what we've been doing, this is the work Beth and I did in South Wales, is you put young people together with older people to come up with ideas. So you've got two knowledge bases coming together. And I famously called it the grandparent syndrome. Grandparents will tell things to grandchildren, they won't tell to children, and vice versa. Because it's a teaching relationship, not an authority relationship. And that concept of and this thing I talked about with anti-Beryl, which we want to do, is young Indigenous people capturing stories from older Indigenous people, but then translating them into their lives. So it becomes a living history mediator, right? And you can only do that on transgenerational.
Chels, you look like you were burning to say something then.
Except me. I was just going to say that, and I think that's, I agree, and that's why intergenerational knowledge transfer is just so important, and it's important for many, many reasons. But one of those is obviously those relationships about learning and all about respect as well, which is a big thing for Aboriginal people and Aboriginal communities. And a lot of the time you do have grandmothers and grandparents with younger kids and hanging out with younger kids, and that's the environment and the situation that I was fortunate in learning a lot of things, and the protocols that come with it also an important thing, and those protocols are things that then are embedded in your psyche and in your behavior for the rest of your life, really.
Well, you're going to be radicalized by whatever you encounter when you hit puberty, aren't you? Because that plasticity that Dave was referring to as well. Like, I don't think racism naturally kicks in at 13. I think it's probably more something to do with the fact that that's when everyone's forced to read Lord of the Flies. Like,
I don't think I think it's the affordance issue, right? It's actually very difficult for racism to occur until after puberty. But then the brain starts to lock down based on its patterns of interaction. So certainly when I was growing up, nobody knew which house we were in overnight. I mean, everybody was in different houses, and I'm sure the parents coordinated in some way or other, but nobody worried too much, and you played on the street, and you had to learn to play with people you didn't like. Yeah, and you had to learn that survival skill. Whereas certainly my children, they got driven to homes of safe parents to play with one or two people in controlled environments. So that ability to adjust to what you're faced with, within a community is lost in that sort of fragmentation. Yeah. And I mean, my mother only went to university because she was a part of a huge extended family. And 3 of her aunts fought her case to be allowed to take the scholarship and not just get married. If she'd just be within her family, she wouldn't have had that cognitive and cultural diversity to give her the right. And I think that's the other point about CANs, that they enable cognitive sovereignty, to use one of Beth's phrases, because they give you diversity of authority. And if you're just in a single family, you don't have diversity of authority. There's only one person in charge.
It's an interesting concept, and I can only reflect on like personal experience, and it's very true that growing up, I didn't just have one set of parents, and I tell this to my daughter all the time. I actually had 3 sets of parents, so that's 6 people, and you can't butter up and manipulate 6 people, especially at the same time. It's just really it's a hard thing to do. And I say that to my daughter, just go with it, because and it was always the thing, it just wasn't worth getting in trouble or doing something outside of, with your behavior that you shouldn't be doing, because you wouldn't get in trouble once, you get in trouble 6 times. And then, then the whole community, and then that factor of shame had come into it as well, and the whole community. And it just sort of, it essentially, I see it as giving one the tools, or giving one the ability to then be able to cope with differences in diversity, differences in mindset, and differences, different paradigms, different religions, different belief systems. Because you're getting this holistic perspective and this holistic nurturing from a very, very young age, and I think it's really important, in that sense.
For me, I quite often refer to complexity as being in a state of perpetual middleness. So when you're at the start of a journey, you kind of know where you are, you can see what's around you. When you're at the end, you've got the retrospective coherence, you've made sense of what's happened, and you can map it all out. But when you're in the middle, there's way more variables. You've got a history to contend with, you've got a future to worry about, and you've got what's going on immediately around you right now. And I'm just kind of getting that sense of, with 6 parents around you, the variables are just multiplied, and how does that work with the connection to past and future as well? So when you've got
power, if you have multiple sources of authority, you have to learn to negotiate power and use power against itself. If you live in an atomistic family, you never learn that ability. Because you're deferring to one authority figure. So the only option available to you is rebellion and withdrawal. And I think one of the things that fascinates me on some of the Maori theories of justice is if your clan will re-accept you, you're exempt from the legal system. So you have to accept the shaming of the clan in order to go in there. And I think some of those things are really important for us to pick up and take across. And we know that from what we did on recidivism in prisons in Singapore, we focused on measuring the family attitude to the prisoner, not the prisoner's motivation. Because if the family would accept the prisoner back, we knew there probably wouldn't be recidivism, because shame took place in that collective environment. And I don't think we do enough of that. We don't, and this is a practical point. We assume everything has to be universal and context-free. We don't allow context-specific solutions to emerge within scaffolding. And I think that applies to justice, it applies to legal systems. Yeah, it's this enlightened myth of universality, which is important. Yeah, because the land isn't universal, humans aren't universal. Everything is context specific, not context free. And the ability to understand and use context is key to scale.
Yeah, it's you need to have an understanding of the local in order for things to be able to scale beyond that. In fact, you need to be grounded in a lot of integrity at the local level.
You see that in mental health.
I think there's a difference between authority. Sorry, we're out of time. We're out of step with our time here. So often we sound like we're going to be speaking over each other, but we both started at the same time. But look, I think I just wanted to flag the difference between and authority too. So like in Chelsea's, that system she was talking about before, the person that speaks for platypus law and that platypus place and the platypus knowledge and all of the associated knowledge in that system, that person has authority, so they have knowledge authority and authority, speaking from that place and for that knowledge. But there's a difference between that and power. They can't boss anybody from that authority. They have authority from there, but there are still no bosses because the power itself is still distributed throughout the entire group in the same way that the knowledge is. So, I mean, and I guess this is maybe a way we can start coming to defining terms for systems, is that idea of how important it is for things to be distributed within that system, or if that's a bit of an oversimplification.
It's one of the big things when I wrote the European Union Field Guide on Managing Complexity, which is just out. One of the things I said is you need to realize as you go up the management chain, you have less and less ability to make decisions. All right, so the high and you only meet angrier and angrier customers. You don't get them, right? But I said there is one point where you have a major crisis, you have to make decisions, but you make decisions to keep options open. That's the big thing we said. Do not make a decision to resolve the problem. Make a decision to keep options open. Then distribute decision-making and enforce collaboration. Yeah, because the decision is out there somewhere, to quote that sort of thing. You have to find ways to connect it. So I think that, but this is I think one of the big things we've got in society at the moment is the concept of authority and power have been separated. Power wasn't an issue where people had authority and understood the limits of their authority. If you lost that, it became an issue of power. And that's one of the problems we got with false news. News commentators used to have authority, so people listened to them. Now they've lost authority, and authority is the person you spoke to last time in Facebook. So it means nothing.
Nailed it.
Well, not completely, because I think one of the issues on scaling is where are the clans, where are the kinship groups, where are the tribes in a modern world? Yeah. So one of the things I argued in Britain some time ago, and the Labour Party didn't adopt it, right? Which is we should reintroduce national service, right? So and the argument was if you want to go to university, you have to serve your community for a couple of years. And you can do it in the armed forces. I'm not a pacifist. I have no problem with violence. It's part of our lives. We've got to learn to live with it, which is, by the way, a brilliant point you make in the book about trying to avoid violence as a mistake. But you can also do it by serving overseas, by going and meeting other cultures and doing things. And I was fundamentally formed in my 20s by Aboriginal land rights in Darwin, which was the most scary experience of my life, by worker priest movement in Buenos Aires. You come back from that, you can't take a little Englander attitude anymore. You just can't see the world from that narrow perspective. But the point is, it was a process by which you understood something. You weren't taught something in a school. This is coming back to an earlier point. You went through a process by which you learned to see things differently. And we've also lost, I mean, I'll give my other favorite example. When at the age of 11 in Welsh schools, well, not anymore, every week you walked to the front of the class and you were given a card and a motion to debate. Wales is a debating tradition. We produce a lot of lawyers, all right? It's one of our lawyers and opera singers are two of our main exports, all right? I'm not sure what that means about us, but we do a lot of that, all right? But basically, the first time I ever did it, I had to argue for capital punishment, which I think is horrendous. But every week from 11 to 18, we had to argue for 7 minutes without preparation on something we might or might not agree with. And that was a brilliant training, because you learned to see things from perspectives by going through those perspectives, not by being taught to be critical. And I think that's what we're lacking. And it's like the, all of the maturity rituals that you see in Indigenous cultures, by which people have to go through on a journey to make a transition. Yeah, we're losing that concept of learning through journeys in favor of learning through communication of somebody else's abstraction. Mm-hmm. So instead of developing your own abstractions, you actually are forced to take somebody else's. Yeah, and again, I think that's one of the key things on scale.
Mm.
And the other thing I really enjoyed in Darwin is you could have an argument, and nobody said you're not allowed to argue with us. It was like, okay, that's what we do, right? And if you can't have an argument, nothing can happen, all right? The issue is whether you take it personally, right?
Well, let's just...
And by the way, that's a Welsh tradition. I failed to communicate that properly, that in our family, if we were polite to you, it meant we weren't sure whether we could trust you or not. Mm. If we trust you, we'll have an argument with you. And you have to warn people about this, because everything's fine and dandy and everybody's being polite. And then one day they just rip into you as a stranger, and you don't realize it means they like you. Mm. So you do have to prepare this.
Well, look, we have a lot of dreaming stories. So on this continent that sort of carry a lot of the really interesting, a lot of really, really good knowledge about sort of the power laws and such that you find with scale and economies of scale, and basically, all those principles of complexity, or around, diversity and distributed, energies and substances and resources and all of these sorts of things. So basically, we have a lot of stories that are about oversized beings, beings that reach a massive size and start to make a mess, start to wreck the place, and there must be an intervention. So other beings must intervene, and they have to basically do a big antitrust thing and break that one up. That one has to be broken up into lots of. So if it's a large catfish tearing up the land, in the Murray-Darling Basin, codfish. Sorry, if it's a massive codfish, then those two brothers have to kill it, and they have to cut it up into all the different pieces, which and they have to become many different fish species to be spread throughout the landscape and throughout the water system. If it's like Tiddalik the frog, who's drinks up all the water until he's a massive being. And another similar story about an echidna doing that way up north. It's always these beings have to be destroyed, broken down, into many smaller parts, and those resources or substances redistributed throughout the system. We have a lot of stories like this. Do you have anything like that from your country? I know there's lots of giant lore and stuff.
We don't have many stories about giants.
Dragons.
Dragons are good things in Wales, not bad things. And if you go into modern storytelling, they live in the firebox of Welsh trains. I mean, that's a beautiful set of stories about Ivor the engine, who has a dragon in his coal box and sings with his whistle in the choir. Right, only Wales could produce that. Now, the Mabinogi is quite interesting because it's a whole body of legends and stories. It's very different from the Irish group. And it's generally about knowledge discovery. So Puel and the Flowers, which is the one I love. And Alan Gardner translated that into a children's book called The Owl Service. And we shouldn't decry children's stories, because it's a triangular love relationship. Yeah. And every generation it's reborn and they fight again, until a generation realizes you don't. And she said she wants to be reborn as flowers, not born as owls. Yeah, and again, so those stories tend to be about those sort of changing those relationships, in the way they work. But I think the size is an important one. And I think one of the things I've been arguing for ages, which I'm finally getting across to some people, is you don't scale a complex adaptive system by imitation or aggregation. You scale it by decomposition and recombination. So you have to break things up into smaller parts and allow them to recombine in different ways. And facilitation, that recombination is key. And that's actually the transgenerational point again, right? You need to find, and this is DNA. I mean, if you look at it, the whole of organic life form comes from 4 chemicals in different combinations. And the trouble is, people love, and this is, I think, building on what you said there, and I've just used one of those terrible phrases I had to build on somebody else's argument, right? But people fall in love with their aggregations. So they build bigger and bigger things, right? And then the identity becomes a problem. One of the problems we got in the UK at the moment is we got what's called muscular unionism. So the English government are trying to say we have to have the Union Jack above the Welsh dragon on all Welsh buildings. Now, I was brought up to call the Union Jack the butcher's apron, because that was its role in colonial policy. But this desire to hold the aggregate together and not allow it to decompose and recombine is a problem. And that was always my argument in Europe. You have to have something which brings finance and defense together to perform a counter to China and the States. But then within that, you need lots of small countries that can combine in different ways, not 4 big countries with lots of small countries. You need this ability for things to be at the right level of granularity, that they combine in different contexts to create something novel. And I think that's the big issue on scaling. And that's a design issue. We don't design for decomposition and recombination. We design for aggregation and imitation.
What do you reckon, Chels? Does size matter?
I found that interesting because we have many of those creation stories as well here. And one in particular is like a giant kangaroo, and and it sits in the landscape just down the road, and then you have a giant where the town is actually named after the giant's knee, which then also represents the river, and changing, or I suppose it's more like embedding in language as well. So so you've got it in language, but then you've also got it visually. So you can actually, it becomes like this tangible entity on the landscape, and that the tangibility then sort of reminds you of that intangible component, which is like that obstruction of some sort. Even the creator that made like rivers and mountains and then made a language that is attached to the different components of the landscape is also a part of that. So I suppose the intent of scaling up before you scale down sort of flows in line with that as well. And then it's part of that deconstruction, and then looking at what is the nexus that's inbuilt in each one of those constructs, and there'd be a common thread. I can guarantee there'd be a common thread. I'll call that.
It's an interesting link with imperialism, though, because one of the things the English did was to impose primogeniture, was to refuse the Welsh the right for primogeniture. Now, we had a tradition, right? I mean, it's quite interesting in Wales, all right? In Welsh law of Hywel Dda, which is the 6th century, women could divorce their husbands for cruelty and take their land. Yeah, and that was given by Edward I as an example of why the Welsh were uncivilized, because we allowed women that right? But the laws allowed bastards to inherit. So the whole of the Welsh tradition is somebody dies, they've got 8 or 9 sons, the sons fight it out, ends up with one of them, it takes about 5 or 6 years, but actually the strongest survives. It was that sort of culture, right? But the English had primogeniture. So basically the king inherited to the son. So the thing became bigger and bigger and was no longer related to the ability of the person, because this thing was having power. And you could never beat a culture like that. With 100-power gorilla in the room, to use that metaphor. And that's issue, and I think this is an issue we're all facing, is how do you allow those sort of local units not to be gobbled up by the big thing? Yeah, and to say that's in all the stories.
But then it can't go the other way, because I know that at the same time the peasantry ended up in a bit of a pickle there in the UK as well, because they were continuously subdividing, the family's common property. With each generation, they had to keep subdividing it so that all the siblings got an equal share, and then subdivided and subdivided and subdivided until everyone's standing on 2 square meters of turnip field, and then they all had to move into the city. That was an oversimplification, but it's got to be careful to go. You don't go the other way as well. The thing in common, the common problem with both of those was land as capital. I think for as long as you've got land as capital, you're going to end up with systems of perverse incentives arising and pretty much tipping over your apple cart every time.
And enclosure was key on that. So if you look in South Wales, people lived in rural communities. They partly survived poverty by hunting, and then the land got encompassed, all right? And the land and the animals now belong to the landowners. So you have to go to the city, all right, to get a job, but then they lay you off if they haven't got the job, and you have to buy your goods from the company store, so they control that. So instead of having a distributed ability for sustenance within a rural community, you end up with a dependent community, the industrial community. And I think that's the thing we're not really working on. Now, one thing COVID has done, which is quite interesting, I mean, the village where I live now has the best baker I've met in my life, who's built a bakery in his garden shed and is selling bread locally and pizzas. So you are starting to get this more distributed approach, and COVID was one of the triggers for that, but we still haven't worked out the mechanisms for it. So how can you distribute without the system becoming highly vulnerable to a big predator? Chelsea's kangaroo, all right? Because the trouble is, if you distribute a system, and that was a problem in Wales, it was a problem in Australia, the tribes could never unite against the colonial in power because they weren't united, they were distributed, and they weren't focused. And I don't think we worked that out yet. And blockchain is not the solution to this. That's a sort of libertarian myth. We can't do it all with technology mediation. We've got to find ways in which we can create different identity structures which have high resilience. I don't think any of us have really worked that out yet. We can see pathways to it, but we haven't worked it out yet.
Yeah, I think what it, like a component of it is, where you look at these microeconomies and as opposed to, macro or global economies, and, getting back to that Indigenous ideology is that, you pretty much had to have your micro trade system and, the assessment of your resources and the vulnerabilities. And, it's almost like, testing that with your neighbors. And if, obviously if it's shit, they're going to tell you it's shit. And it's then that relationships between each that then was essentially the foundation and the formation of being able to, have that closed economy, or that tight economy. And then obviously that then spread further, but it wasn't on a scale that, depleted resources, because obviously there was law that was attached to how far you would go. And that was law also to, reproduction. And it was also law attached to your movement and where you could move and go. So it's those components, I suppose, that then when you use like economies as the example, the macroeconomy works because, they're resilient and they're adaptable, more so than something that's, at a larger scale. You've got, less people, more ability to be able to maneuver them. Whereas I think as you start emulating out, you lose that ability to be able to, I don't want to say it's not control, but being able to have those relationships and those networks that are founded on similarities in resources.
Now, one of the things I learned in Kakadu in the 70s, and I need to be careful here because one of the things I discovered in Broken Hill is telling white fellas stories that they repeat which aren't true is actually a game, and I understand that, all right? So one of the things I got taught in Kakadu was gifting is not the same thing as exchange. All right, and I've been fascinated by that ever since, because a gift is something you give to a community to be a member of it. but it's not a mechanism for exchange. It's a boundary condition. And I think one of the things I'm interested in terms of economics is that a sustainable model? Because the minute you have a means of exchange, whether it's money or blockchain, the person who owns the means of exchange has the real power rather than the thing it's represented. Whereas gifting cultures don't do that. You know, gifting seems to me a more localized phenomenon, but I've never fully understood it. I just remember from that whole series of conversations in Kakadu that seemed to be central, certainly to the way to those people organized. Yeah, is there wasn't an exchange. It was an entry barrier. If you didn't gift, you might be excluded, but the gift wasn't then reciprocated, except in a more general sense.
Well, what you've created is a relationship, and that's what the exchange is for, and that's the purpose of the economy. Traditional economy is to increase relatedness. So we do here at the Indigenous Knowledge Systems Lab. So one of our founding members here is John Davis. He's from the Bunya Mountains, and so the Bunya Mountains, that's been a site of big gatherings for lots of different tribes. They'll come from thousands of miles, you know, all to come and gather in that place every 3 years. So it's a site of embassy, and so there's this concept he calls Wanju from there, that we kind of employ in the labs, and he translates it as collective sense making. So it's that way that we have of pretty much, I don't know, we've been modeling that tonight with what we've been doing with these two different mobs coming together and trying to do some collective sense making, you know, together from these very different cultures, you know. Yeah, so that's what that's what we build that on, but that's also the basis for an economy and for trade, because that big keystone species there is the bunya tree, which fruits every 3 years in abundance, and that's what people come for, and that's you know, that mother's milk and everything else. It's you know, so that's the big thing that's traded, and there's an abundance of it. And that's what forms the basis of that economic system there.
And there's an irony here in that, you know, one of the things I've been trying to do is to get funding to investigate that. Yeah.
Right.
Is how can you build gifting as a microeconomic tool from which you can rebuild society? And gifting, of course, also includes the gift of the land and the gift to the land. It's more than gift.
If the gift itself isn't the commodity. Yeah. The gift itself can't be where the value is. The value is in the relation and tracking those relations, which is what a currency is supposed to be doing. Beth, I want to hear from this matriarchy too from Wales. Before we run out of our time.
A kind of metaphor that comes to mind for me, and that's that the jockey's only as fast as his horse, and that if you don't look after the horse, you're not going to go very fast. So this idea of kind of non-extractive or non-depletion type economies, which I think is again fundamental to pretty much all Indigenous cultures, as far as I'm aware, to not take more than the land can sustain. And I think that same thing applies to human well-being and the economy. That a disgruntled, unlooked after workforce, you know, isn't going to be a very fast horse. So yeah, recognizing we've got 3 minutes left, I'll leave it on that.
Nice. Well, Chels and Dave, you want to wrap up with some thoughts?
Let me go first, then Chels can have the last word, which I think is probably a good thing, right, in this community. I think one of the terrible things Australia and the UK are doing at the moment, it builds on that last thing, is if you want to do a university degree in something which industry wants to buy, it's cheap. If you want to study the humanities, it's too expensive. And that's all about, we'll take people out of university, we'll exhaust them for 10 years, we'll throw them on the scrap heap and replace them. And only the elite will be allowed to understand the bigger picture. Yeah. And the UK is going down the same route. And I think that's one of the fundamental injustices. I come back to where I started with the Caban of North Wales and the Workers' Educational Institutes in South Wales. if you don't allow people to be educated in things which are abstractions above the level of material need, then they lose power. And that's also where stories are common abstractions. And I think that's what we've got to address, because otherwise we're into a really bad place in the future.
I'll just I'll emphasize on what Beth sort of was talking about, just this you know, the Indigenous societies, you know, operating on those small scales, and you know, it's all about that sustenance of livelihood, and a lot of them, and it still occurs, you know, on the fringes of and the margins of dominant society. And you know, it's that strong intergenerational awareness of knowledge and ecological processes and change and exchange. And yeah, that essentially builds you know, socio-ecological resilience, and you know, moving into, you know, the unknowns of, you know, climate change and, you know, the political agendas attached to that. You know, we're in this this dimension of where collectively, you know, we have the ability to shift and change paradigms and some of the ways that we operate and maneuver, you know, in our place, in our space. And yeah, that to emulate out then to others is important. And you know, for jargon and for Bari, which is, you know, my place and my place in country, you know, the first thing is about, you know, that unity with the environment and in its holistic and symbiotic nature. You know, that cultural law that's embedded within the environment that then is embedded, you know, simultaneously in me. You know, the geographic relationships that reinforces that belonging in place, and with my neighbours and mobs around me, and those that are connected through kin, and that endurance over many generations to be able to have that intergenerational knowledge transfer and keep that continuing going through time and space. And then, you know, emerging from that is that distinctiveness around culture, and then those cultural paradigms that are attached to that, you know, the systems of knowledge, that emerges out of that, and a lot of them are systems of knowledges in sustainability. And you know, it's that equity to living systems, and the language attached to that equity in the living systems. I think, you know, in my place, my Jagun and country, and within Australia, you know, and being an Indigenous person, they're the key things that I absolutely love about my culture and about, you know, Australian, you know, Indigenous cultural systems. I just think that they're fantastic, and I think, you know, if you know, these dominant paradigms sort of, you know, through the power of people could shift and change, and we start looking at new world paradigms, you know, I think that that would make me a very you know, contented sort of person by the end of my my cycle, yeah, on in this realm.
Nice. Well, it's that the big message there is that the equity is in those living systems. And I think that's equity in every sense of the word, which is great. What a great way to start this this series. Just thank you all so much. Just really good. Thanks for the wise words, Chels, and the just the rigor that you always bring. And thanks, Beth, for just that for adding the dimension of time to the sort of flat plane of space that we were occupying until you brought that in, which was really good. Yeah, I think that really enriched things. And thanks, of course, Dave. We'll continue with many of these, I hope. You know, with lots of different people coming in and yarning. I've just been such a big fan of your work, and I'm you know, I never thought I'd have a chance to speak to you, let alone do something like this. So it's pretty remarkable. And
and that's entirely reciprocated, Tyson. I haven't imagined that, so it's been cool. But thank you for mediating the session as well.
Yeah,
somebody had to do that, and you took on the burden.
Oh, a very light hand. But of course, because nobody boss blame. We can't have bosses run around in here. That's the first protocol right there. Well, thank you all so much. It was what a mad way to start. Absolutely beautiful, and many more to come.
Julie, they're all yours again.
Thanks everyone.
Thank you. Diolch.
Base.
Everyone say goodbye in their language.
Yeah,
Diolch yn fawr.
Apo.
Diolch.